Okay, if you'll join me, let's go ahead and open in prayer. We'll begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen. In the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Like the hey Yaki keeps on throwing on. Did you send an email to stop?
I did.
Or does it just keep on sending it?
I sent an email and the person replied, sorry, I thought we were voting. Said, no, it's a suggestion box. It's not American Idol.
Oh yeah, I did that.
I don't know if it was quite 100, but it was a lot.
What was it doing? Like just sending the same email over and over?
I think just filling out the same Google form over and over again.
Who did that?
The man believes in the song. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to do these 3 things. If by the end of class you cannot do these 3 things, then I have failed you as a teacher. I'll do my best. Please do your best. Would somebody like to read number 3, please? Thank you, Harry.
Identify the achievements and failures of Jefferson's presidency.
Yes, we're going to talk today about Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is such an interesting character in American history. I think I've described him so far as being like the poet. He's, I don't know if he actually wrote poetry, but he has kind of a poet's heart. He is an introvert. He doesn't really like being the center of attention, but in a way that is so perfectly Jefferson, he can't not be the center of attention. He hates it and craves it, I think. Let's talk for a second about Jefferson before we go on. Jefferson is, a lot of historians have a hard time with this guy. They have a hard time with him because he lived long enough to be a pre-revolutionary figure of the Revolution, of the early Republic, and eventually an elder statesman. And in that time, he held kind of every position on every topic. He's a dynamic person whose thinking changes, who appears to say one thing and do another, and do something and then try to figure it out later and deny, he doesn't deny it, but he's he understands that he's a complicated person, and he is. He's actually, aren't we all? He's actually kind of a mess to study. There's one of the great historians called him America's Sphinx. He just doesn't make sense. And you try to figure him out, and then all of a sudden, the next chapter happens, and it's totally different than what you expect. And I think one of the best examples of it is when you look at a picture of Thomas Jefferson. You know who he is. You know that's Jefferson. But every artist that tried to paint him or draw him or sculpt him, they all look a little different. They're all recognizably Jefferson, but they're all different. It's as if the artist can't figure him out either, or as if he's constantly changing a little bit along the way. We'll see some pictures of Jefferson. You'll watch how you know right away it's Jefferson, but they don't really look like the other ones, as if people of his time can't figure him out either. Okay, would somebody like to read number 4, please? Harry, you've already gone. Thank you, Richard.
Explain the domestic and international conflicts of the early 19th century.
Yes. What's your question?
Does it mean his views were kind of always different?
So kind of. There's sort of the classic Jeffersonian position, that's the Democratic Republicans, that you shouldn't have a strong central government, that you should hand down power to the states, that the ideal model of the country is the yeoman farmer taking care of his own business. And those things become consistent over time. But, in one sense, he's writing in the Declaration of Independence how slavery is an evil, and yet he's a slave owner, right? You'll see him talk about, the powers of government are strictly written in the Constitution. He's a strict constitutionalist, and yet he turns around with the Louisiana Purchase, which is totally not the Constitution at all. But he's yeah, it's worth it. He has some things that are his constant principles, yet he's also willing to walk back his principles in the moment, which is all of us. I don't know who said it, but we're all flawed people, right? We all say one thing and do another. I promise every time in the confessional that I will sin no more and to avoid the near occasions of sin. I promise to sin no more, and yet I'm going back in that confessional, right? Like we all do that. We end up saying one thing and doing another. Okay, so for number 4, the domestic and international conflicts of the early 19th century. Early 19th century is the 1800s. We're going to talk about what was going on in the rest of the world and how we got dragged into those issues. Also, how we pretty much marched into the issues domestically on our turf also. And would somebody like to read number 5, please? Yeah, thank you, Fancy.
Analyze the origins, conduct, and conclusion of the War of 1812.
Yeah, the War of 1812 is this great story that most Americans actually don't know that much about. Like, you may be vaguely aware that the War of 1812 existed. You might, if you're like kind of a music nerd, you know that that's where Francis Scott Key was writing the Star-Spangled Banner. You might know that the War of 1812 is the reason that the White House is painted white today, because the scorch marks were so bad when the British burned it, they had to cover it up with white paint. But you probably don't know anything really about the War of 1812, and you might have not known those things. It's kind of a forgotten war, that if you're kind of aware that it exists, it's sort of in the yada yada years of American history. So good, we'll talk about the origins, conduct, conclusion of the war. So when you go home tonight and your parents say, "What did you learn in school today?" you don't have to look at them and say, "Nothing," like you've been saying since you were 8. Instead, you could say, "Well, Mother, well, Father, shall we identify the achievements and failures of Jefferson's presidency?" And they'll say, "Why, yes, child, that'll make a thrilling dinner time conversation. And you'll have something to talk about. How exciting will that be? Huh?" Very more exciting indeed. Good. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 3. When Jefferson was... See, look, you know that's Jefferson, but he looks different. Harry's looking a little Bill Clinton-y, you know, like the eyes, the hair. He might have not. Okay, so Jefferson takes power. He wins election in 1800. You'll remember that the election of 1800 kind of pointed out a few flaws. One, in how the Electoral College was going to do its business, but also like how partisan politics was changing the game in the way that nobody saw coming. The election of 1800 was ugly. It was an ugly election. In 1800, he wins election. In 1801, at the time, the inauguration was in March. Yeah, and so in 1801, he's going to take office, and he realizes that he's presiding over a divided country in a sense of turmoil. And so he knows that it's his job to be everybody's president, and so he promises, in what's really a great piece of American political rhetoric, he says that we are all Federalists. We are all Republicans. It's this great, like, bridge-building moment. In reality, he doesn't. Man, so Jefferson, he'll say one thing and then does another. In practice, he tried to dismantle all of the Federalist policies from the Adams administration. And even though Washington wasn't a Federalist, kind of everything he did was Federalist. He's like, no, I'm not a member of a party. You know, I'm George Washington, I don't party. But kind of like every position he took was a Federalist position. Jefferson comes into office and he tries to dismantle the entire Federalist edifice. He started pardoning people which were imprisoned by the Sedition Act. He's like, the Federalists are all about this big, strong central government. He starts eliminating government jobs and laying off people and trying to get the federal government back small again. He slashed the Army and the Navy. Jefferson doesn't believe in a strong Army and a strong Navy. He says what that is just something that's going to drag us into foreign conflict or threaten our own people. And in either way, we've got to have a bunch of taxes to go pay for it, and that also threatens our people. So Jefferson wants to get out of the Army and Navy business. He's cutting government employees. He's pardoning people that have been in prison, saying that wrongly so. And he abolishes basically all of the taxes except tariffs. So like the whiskey tax, all the excise taxes, all of that stuff, he cuts all of it. The only thing he keeps in place are the tariffs, which people don't object to as a way of raising funds from trade. That seems a fair way to raise money. And in the face of it, he actually ends up paying off a noticeable portion of the national debt. So Jefferson is, I think today we would look at this and say, this looks like a pretty successful run. I mean, paying down the debt, reducing tax burdens, freeing people which were, maybe wrongfully imprisoned. And in a lot of ways, Jefferson looks like he's setting some stuff up nicely. This will also come to backfire on him, and we'll get that soon. Yeah?
What would happen if America paid off their national debt?
It does happen from time to time.
What?
Our debt today is not the Hamilton debt. It's been paid off. Yeah. Economists today argue that a certain amount of debt is actually pretty important for managing the economy. There's different opinions on it. Yeah.
Wait, so when was the last time our debt was at 0?
I should know this.
I was going to say, were we ever in the pub?
Yeah, I think. I'm going to say this and I'm recording it. That's bad. I think in the early 60s. I think. I could be wrong on that. I'll tell you what. You can use your computer for 2 minutes, find out the last time the country was debt-free. Okay, report back.
What's the benefit of not being in debt?
So if being in debt or not in debt?
Well, not in debt because, it seems like the government just will keep spending that money.
I think I made the comment last time that government money is infinite. The idea would be that if we spend a lot of our tax revenue on interest payments, then we're not really building our country, we're just paying interest. So to use the money more wisely. Yeah, Harry, what do you got?
Said that the only time in history that we have been 100% debt-free was in 1835.
1835.
with Andrew Jackson.
Nice. Okay, well there's been some times that it's been pretty manageable then. But yeah, okay, Andrew Jackson. We'll get Andrew Jackson in this unit. Andrew Jackson is one of my favorite stories. He's not one of my favorite presidents, but he's one of my favorite stories in history. We'll get him a little bit today, but we'll pick up his presidency before the end of this unit. Okay, subpoint B. I want to introduce some important characters here. Some of these people are going to be pretty significant. The first person I want you to meet is John Marshall. John Marshall is a Federalist. John Adams appointed Marshall to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He is not the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's like the fourth one, but he's the first one that matters. He's the first one that matters. He gets appointed to the Supreme Court, and so there's this guy on YouTube. He's a history teacher. He's kind of famous among history teachers on YouTube, which is, I know, a small world. But his name is Keith Hughes. Sometimes I've used his videos in class. He calls himself Hip Hughes. He seems like a nice guy, but he also seems like the kind of guy that would call himself hip. I don't know him. I never met the man. He's probably awesome. But every time he refers to Marshall, he calls him John Schwarzenegger Marshall. Schwarzenegger, like crushing power. Marshall is a Federalist. Federalists like big central governments, right? And so he's Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and Marshall established the court's power to review laws of the Congress and the states. He basically establishes judicial review, which is not specifically in the Constitution. Now, the founders probably intended it to be a power. It's written about in the Federalist Papers, the idea of judicial review, but it doesn't specifically appear in the Constitution. There's a few things in government that are like that don't specifically exist, but people just agree they kind of exist. Judicial review is one of them. Let's talk about the story of how that happened. It happens in a Supreme Court case, which you must 100% memorize this term, Marbury versus Madison. Marbury v. Madison, you must immediately know it's the case of judicial review. Okay? That has to be in the front drawer of your American history brain. Marbury v. Madison, judicial review, 1803. And what happens is that there's a Judiciary Act, there's two. Okay, if you read the Constitution, Article 1 of the Constitution is about setting up the Congress. The founders thought the Congress was going to be, the legislature was going to be the most important branch. So it's the longest of the articles. It's very specific. Article 2 is the executive branch. It is also kind of long, but it's not nearly as specific. When the founders are writing the Constitution, they're imagining George Washington in the role of president, and they kind of figured that they're going to let Washington determine how the office will run. They put a lot of faith in the man to go establish this branch. So it's kind of long also, but not nearly as specific as it is with the powers of Congress. They also think the presidency is going to be the second most important branch. They put it in the second article. We moderns would probably flip that today. We probably think the presidency is the most important branch. The executive branch is the most important branch. But at the time they thought legislature number 1, 2 is the executive, and then 3 was the Supreme Court. You get down to the Supreme Court, the judicial branch. Article 3, the judicial branch. There should be a Supreme Court. Probably some other courts. Article 4. It's very short. I'm simplifying it, but it's very short because the founders knew that the judicial branch would need to kind of evolve and kind of figure itself out, and that they would pass laws along the way to build that up. Yeah?
Should the president be the most important part?
That's an excellent political science question, which we could talk about later, but not. Let's stay in this moment. Okay. So there's 2 laws I want you to know, or 2 laws you'll need to know about for this story. The first one is the Judiciary Act of 1789. The Judiciary Act of 1789 authorized the courts to, it basically sort of set up their structure and what they would do, and kind of gave them the powers of how a court should operate. And then, secondly, the Judiciary Act of 1780 actually goes through 1790. The Judiciary Act of 1790 goes and sets up what all the district courts are and creates a whole bunch of new court positions that have to go be filled by judges. Okay? That's 1790. Man, I have this date wrong too. 1798. I'm saying these decades wrong. 1798 and then 1799. Yeah, that would have to be right. That's about right. Okay, so passing up, basically, all that's kind of beside the point. We're setting up the powers of the judicial branch. John Adams, in 1800, loses re-election, just as they're establishing all of these new courts along the way. So he realizes that he's not going to return to office, but there's all these new courts with all these new judges to be appointed. And in a flurry of activity in the last days of office, really it's kind of like at the last minute, he starts appointing judges to all of these spots. What political party is John Adams?
Federalist.
He's a Federalist, good. Thomas Jefferson's coming into office. What political party is Jefferson?
Democrat, Republican.
Okay, good. Yeah, the Republicans, the Democrats, the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonian Democrats, whatever. He's the other side. Adams knows all these appointments because he's basically saying, I need to put Federalists in place before Jefferson, my one-time friend and now political rival, is going to dismantle everything I did, which is totally what Jefferson's going to do. So for what becomes known as the Midnight Judges, he appoints among them William Marbury to be the federal judge in Washington, D.C., in the District of Columbia, the Justice of the Peace. We use that term a little differently today, but the Justice of the Peace in the District of Columbia, basically the head federal judge for the federal city. Now, the way that presidential appointments work, the president decides on the person. If it needs to, it gets approved by the Senate. They have a certificate. They say, I, President Joe Walberg, of the sovereign nation of Walberica, appoint Richard Schmidt to be a federal judge in the 3rd District or whatever, 3rd Territory. I have this paper filled out. And until I actually hand it to Richard, he's not a judge. Right? Because what if I change my mind? What if we're along the way and it's like, Richard, it was a huge mistake. What am I doing? Scratch that out. Write in Danielle Guzman, right? Guzman. And that's who's going to be the judge. So it's not official until Richard is holding the paper. Flurry of activity, appoints all these midnight judges, names William Marbury. At the last minute, John Adams leaves office, and Thomas Jefferson comes in, and the appointments have not been delivered. And Thomas Jefferson instructs his Secretary of State, James Madison, Jimmy, Madison, Mad Dog, don't deliver those commissions. I know that they were created by a validly elected sitting president in his term of office, approved by the Senate, and ready to deliver, but he didn't deliver them. Lose the papers, put them in a drawer, have your dog eat them. Don't deliver those commissions. We don't want the entire judicial branch to be tied up with Federalists for the rest of their lives. Do not deliver those papers. And Madison, it's like, okay, yeah, done. William Marbury feels wronged. He feels deeply wronged. He says, man, like I'm caught in some dirty politics here. I am a rightfully appointed judge. The president named me. The Senate confirmed me. The papers filled out. It's just on your desk. It's like when you turn in homework late and the teacher gets to it, they grade it when they're good and ready, and you're like, come on, grade the thing, right? Marbury's like, I have been appointed. And he sues James Madison in court for the delivery of this paper. He says, this goes all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1803 in a case called Marbury versus Madison. And he goes and he sues the Supreme Court, he sues up to the Supreme Court and demands a legal tool called a writ of mandamus. The writ of mandamus existed because of the Judiciary Act of, the one I can't remember, the something, and 1789, Judiciary Act 1789, and which created the right for writ of mandamus. And so he says, hey, John Marshall, Supreme Court, issue a court order forcing Madison to deliver my appointment. John Marshall hears this case. What political party is John Marshall? He's a Federalist, right? He's a strong Federalist. He's John Schwarzenegger Marshall. And so Marbury feels like he's got this one in the bag. Like, my boy's the judge. I got it. Marshall, though, realizes this is kind of a pickle of a situation. This is kind of a pickle. Because he could issue that court order and demand that Madison deliver the writ to Marbury. But let's do our little political science here. Which branch makes the laws? The legislative branch. Good. Which branch interprets the laws? The judicial branch. Which branch enforces the laws? The executive branch. So, if the interpretation of the court is that Madison should deliver the papers to Marbury, who's actually in charge of carrying out this court order? Yeah, Jefferson. But Jefferson could be like, nah, I don't want to. I'm making a swivel chair. Can't play in the old violin. Can't, I don't have time. Sorry, bud. Didn't get to it. Yeah, TJ. Yeah. So John Marshall knows that if he tries to force some other branch to comply, it'll be powerless. And John Marshall knows that you don't pick fights you can't win. There's nothing worse than setting yourself up to lose a battle. So, what if he denies Marbury's case? If he says, I will not issue a writ of mandamus. Well, then again, Jefferson's the winner. And it looks like the executive branch is more powerful than the judicial branch, because he's like, nah, I'm not going to pick a fight, I'm not going to win, and I'm going to lose. And so I'm the third of the government. I can't just give in. But Marshall's in a lose-lose. He doesn't have any way to win on this one. He either issues the writ, which is unenforceable, or he doesn't issue the writ, and he looks like, the judicial branch is a puppet of the executive branch. So in kind of a classic Marshall approach, he says, this is a politically dangerous situation. Let's boil it down to the law. And he comes up with kind of a classic Marshall approach. Complicated situation. Let's put it into 3 questions. Question number 1. Does Marbury deserve the appointment? Question number 2, if he does deserve the appointment, and he's been denied the appointment, then does he have some recourse? Does he have some way to get it? And third, if he does have recourse, is it a writ of mandamus that does so? So let's walk through them. Does William Marbury have a valid appointment by a sitting president confirmed by the Senate? Is that true?
Yeah.
Yes. He is a duly appointed judge. 2, if he has a valid appointment, does he have a way to remedy it if it's been denied to him? Does he have some way to like stick up for himself? Okay, we've got some mixed answers here. What did Marbury do? He sued. So there is a court system. There is a way to go make his voice heard. And it looks like a writ of mandamus is the way you would do it. Question number 3. Is a writ of so yes. Is a writ of mandamus the right way to do this? And here, John Marshall does a masterful stroke. He says, I got some bad news for you, Bill. The Constitution doesn't actually give me a writ of mandamus. I mean, the legislature passed it, and the president signed it, but they shouldn't have. It's not the job of the Supreme Court to go issuing court orders, to issue directives. If it's a law, then it's got to come out of the legislature, and if it's an enforcement, it's got to come out of the executive. I'm sorry, Marbury. You're going to get screwed on this one. She says, yes, yes, no. Yes, you have the right to the appointment. Yes, this is the way you would claim that right. But no, I can't help you. And John Marshall strikes down the Judiciary Act of something or other, the part that gave him the ability to have the writ of mandamus. He says, it's not constitutional. I can't help you. And in that move, John Marshall does something that is far greater than William Marbury. He establishes a new power for the judicial branch of government. He creates judicial review, which doesn't exist before him. Now Madison was like, ha ha, I won, Supreme Court is weak, this is great, executive branch rules. And in the short term, Madison's the winner here. In the short term, the Supreme Court actually loses a little bit of power because they had the ability to issue court orders. And they're like, no, I actually don't have that power, can't do it. In the short term, John Marshall actually checks the power of his own third branch. Yet he does something far greater and establishes the other side of the check and balance, that he can overturn laws that the other two branches have approved. Subpoint C. Yes. Let's talk about Jefferson's presidency. And again, he looks different. Jefferson had this like strawberry blonde hair. It was a redhead. Nobody knows what to do with it. Okay. Jefferson was like, the powdered wig era was over. And everybody's like, ooh, you have red hair? That's weird. Okay. Subpoint C. As president, Jefferson basically tried to increase settlers to the west. He comes up with ways. He says, okay, the future of America is in farming and yeoman farmers. We need to settle out this land better. We have too much population density in New England. We have some big estate farmers in the south. We should turn westward and establish new settlements to the west. And so he seizes the opportunity to increase flow of settlers to the west. His party passed laws which would change the way, like the minimum acreage available for purchase. So they make smaller plots of land to try to make more availability of the settlers. So that's step number 1, how he's approaching the west. Number 2, okay. The last time we talked about this part of the earth, France had just ceded it to Spain in the years after the French and Indian War and then the American Revolution. The France gave it to Spain after the French and Indian War. In 1801, Napoleon, who's the Emperor of France, Napoleon coerced Spain into returning the Louisiana Territory back to France. Then Napoleon said, we want to make sure the Americans don't settle our territory. And so Napoleon ordered Spanish officials to restrict any Americans trying to get into New Orleans, which is so like here's Spanish Florida, New Orleans is like right here, and they like basically New Orleans is an important port city. The Mississippi River is an important travel city, so like they try to block Americans from getting into New Orleans, which would give them access into the French territory. That was in 1801. To avoid hostilities with France, basically Jefferson doesn't want to go pick a war with France. France's one-time ally is starting to look like a rival. And so Jefferson doesn't want to go pick a war with France. And so he instructs the American minister in Paris to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans. He's like, what if we just buy the city from you? Can we do that? So he orders them to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans. By April of 1803, Bonaparte and James Monroe, who's the Secretary of State, concluded what became known as the Louisiana Purchase for $15 million. Today that's around $500 million. That's still a pretty good price for basically doubling the size of your country. So negotiates a $15 million purchase to do so. Here's this is such a Jefferson move. Jefferson's like, small government, strict constructionist. If it's not on the page, we can't do it. There's nothing in the Constitution about buying a second country. Like, this is not a power of the executive branch, not a power of the president to do so. But Jefferson's like, yeah, I think it's worth it. Let's do it. It's kind of it's such a Jefferson moment. It's an exception to his typically strict constructionism. In 1804, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on an expedition to go explore this new territory, to go find out about its topography, animals, plants, and people of all of the Louisiana territory. And he names Lewis and Clark to go do so. Lewis and Clark are pretty interesting folks. Meriwether Lewis was a naturalist. He was an explorer, but he's kind of like, today we would call him a field biologist. He was also quite the diplomat, and he could just got along well. I'm oversimplifying his character, but Clark, on the other hand, was very different. Clark, basically he's a captain in the Army, and he's an Army man. He's a protocol guy. He's not interested the same way that Lewis is, but he's the nails that keeps everything running. These two guys make an excellent team, so much so today that we just refer to them in one breath. They're just called Lewis and Clark, right? Like as if they're the same person. And they go south across the territory. They travel 1,000 miles up the Missouri River. The Missouri River is actually the longest river in North America. Everybody thinks it's a Mississippi, but it's actually the Missouri River. It goes 1,000 miles up the Missouri River up to what's the Mandan territory, Native Americans that are up there. The Mandan and the Hidatsa people were farming tribes. They're farming tribes that were getting threatened by the increasingly powerful Sioux Indians. Basically, the Lewis and Clark make friends with the Mandans and the Hidatsas and set up, they winter there. They stay over winter, which is important because they're in what's today North Dakota, and it's freaking cold, and they gotta have a safe place to be for future travel. Eventually, they would go on a 1,300-mile trek all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Part of their charge was that they were supposed to go find a sea route or a water route to the Pacific and eventually to China and Asia. That doesn't exist, but you get pretty close. You get pretty close. They go up and they travel through, they come across what's today Montana, and they go meet up with a variety of Native American tribes. They have to cross the Rockies, and they're crossing the Rockies through enemy Indian territory. All these tribes are rivaling each other for power. They're kind of dwindling in power with the arrival of weapons. Every tribe is like trying to hold on to what they've got. There actually is no known passage through the Rockies. Once the tribes got all violent, all the tribes like basically stopped trying to cross back and forth into each other's territory. There's this great story that they find, I think he's a Blackfoot Indian, who's an old man, and he's like, yeah, I took a pass through the Rockies when I was a boy. I think I know the way, and it's been like decades since anybody's taken this route, and he just leads Lewis and Clark expedition through it, and it's successful. Like everything about these guys, like that shouldn't work, and it works. It's like over and over again. These guys were miracle workers. So they got, made it. They successfully make it down the Columbia River and go find the Pacific. There, they have two choices. Jefferson gave them what's essentially a blank check if they want to go catch a boat and sail down all the way underneath South America and come back up to Philadelphia, Washington, the other side. But they decide, you know what? Let's go figure out what the interior looks like. So they go across the plains and they, find angry Indian tribes and just about get everybody killed, and before they finally make it back.
It was still a really good idea to go across land just to see what was there.
Yeah, it's pretty risky.
It was a lot more dangerous.
It was a lot more dangerous, and their charge was to get to here.
Yeah.
It was not really to get home. Jefferson allowed them to come out because that was the goal, find the route. They fulfilled their task. But they do. They're frontiersmen, they're adventurers, so they go and set back across it. It was super risky. The amazing thing about Lewis and Clark is that 2.5 years later, after setting out with about 100 men, they return with most of them. Like, this should have gotten any of them killed at any turn, and it's by their great leadership that it's a successful trip. So there's, this would have been, these are trading ports. All the Native American tribes, they would have done business. Yeah, that would have existed. Yeah, was it? Yeah. The 1804-1806 journey, invaluable information, paved the way for a transcontinental study, and basically inspired predictions of spanning the continent. When they return by 1806, the plans are set for the settlement. Basically, these guys show that it's possible, show that you can do it, and the wheels were running. Subpoint E. Okay, let's turn back to international affairs. In Europe, they're facing the Napoleonic Wars. I think we've said this now for a couple of classes. France goes through its revolution. It goes disastrously bad. They're in chaos and anarchy in the streets. Napoleon shows up, puts down the rebellion, and establishes Napoleonic France. But he takes over at a time that France is like, man, we hate kings. We hate kings lots and lots. And everywhere there's kings, we should go fight them. And France gets into wars all over Europe. Everybody with a monarchy. And Napoleon, who's totally not a king. He's an emperor. He's totally not a king. Is leading all of these overthrowing kings, putting his buddies on the thrones and his family members and his pals along the way. So Europe is in a state of war. Just about every country is fighting on some side of the Napoleonic Wars. And Americans are like, dude, that's a bad deal, Europe. I bet you can't do any farming right now. You can buy our stuff, though. That's cool. And so America becomes an agricultural export nation. And for a while, it looks like Jefferson was right. That we can just be a farm economy and go send off our extra grain and chickens or whatever to the east, and everything will be all right. So it kind of looks like the Jefferson bargain is going to win. But to do so, American ships sail into the Mediterranean to go into harbor. The Mediterranean is being kind of there's a street gang, I guess it's boats, water. There's a water gang in the Mediterranean led by a bunch of pirates from North Africa. The people sailing North Africa are the Berbers. They're, I don't want to use the term tribe, so it's like a Muslim ethnic group and a variety of ethnic groups along the north, but they're good sailors, and essentially every time a ship goes into the Mediterranean, these pirates swoop down to go capture their ships and take their stuff. They're pirates. And what's known as the Barbary Coast, the Barbary pirates, begin harassing American ships along the way. And Jefferson's like, I kind of wish you wouldn't do that. We're just trying to do business here. And so you got to stop these extortion payments, basically bribes. You American ship, you want to go to Grenada, then go pay the toll. And they're just floating extortion bribery ships. And if you don't pay them, they'll steal all your stuff and sink your boat. So Jefferson's like, all right, we're going to go to war. We're going to go to war. And so you got to stop these extortion payments, basically bribes. You American ship, you want to go to Grenada, then go pay the toll. And if you don't pay them, they'll steal all your stuff and sink your boat. So Jefferson's like, all right, this means war. And he authorizes the American Navy to go and swoop in and try to beat the Barbary pirates. It's not a war. Jefferson doesn't have the authority to wage war. That has to come out of Congress. But he is the commander-in-chief, which means that he has some power over the military. And for 4 years, we get into America's first international conflict, the Barbary Wars, which are not wars, against the Barbary pirates, which end in kind of a stalemate. We don't actually beat the pirates. We do negotiate lower bribes. Yeah, what do you got?
I thought Jefferson didn't have a navy.
So it did exist, but he cut it down to kind of about nothing. Yeah, Jefferson doesn't like military conflict, yet he gets into it. It's so Jeffersonian, yeah.
If like that, the war on the pirates.
Yeah.
That kind of correlates like the war on terror in terms of like how hard it is to fight against them.
Yeah, it's certainly a moving target, yeah. That there's not really like a power you're dealing with. You're dealing with rogues. Yeah, for sure. It's unsuccessful. It's a classic Jefferson move. Okay. Back at home, back on the ranch, fearing that westward expansion, the new settling of the Louisiana Territory, feeling that westward expansion would go and threaten traditional power holders in America, New England Federalists, who are already skeptical of Jefferson, they began talking about, you know what, maybe the American experiment, this didn't go well for us. What if we were to just split and be like a New England country and just leave America to the south, whatever, everything south of there. And this was put out, this was like encouraged by our old friend Aaron Burr. Okay, in our last class, O Theophilus, we talked about the Hamilton-Burr duel coming out of the election of 1800. I basically put that in there just because the musical nerds want to talk about the duel. It's a little asynchronous. That was not the final reason for the duel. Okay, we're going to talk about a different storyline here. Aaron Burr was leading an insurrection movement to go split a new country from America. Aaron Burr, at this point, had been a Federalist. He split and was a Jeffersonian Democrat and was actually back, you know, kind of like caucusing with the Federalists once it looked like there was a route to a new way into power. And Burr's plan was either to capture territory in New Spain and go start a new country, go like lead an American army regiment and go split off a new country from Spain, or if that wasn't going to go work, to go just capture the Louisiana Territory and install himself as a president in the new land. This was kind of the Burrian plot. Okay? And today this sounds like crazy talk. And like, was Burr losing his marbles? I don't know. But I will say that he had a lot of people following him in this plan. And this seemed like a viable option. So Burr goes and sets out to do that. And Hamilton's like, dude, you can't, like, that's insurrection. Yeah, what do you got?
So would this movement of Aaron Burr kind of like reflect the idea of the Pilgrims coming to the United States?
I don't know if it would reflect the Pilgrims coming to the United States. It's more in like the Lockean model. It's more of saying like New England feels screwed by the government with westward expansion. And if you feel like your government is violating your rights, then maybe you should just go start your own country. It's more like Burr is taking up the mantle of the Revolution. Burr fought in the Revolution. He knows what's up. He was a decorated officer. This seems like a horse you could ride if you didn't like the way things were going. So Hamilton shoots him down, says that's a conspiracy to destroy the Union. Burr's like, oh, what, man? And it's like, it's honor culture. He has to go defend his honor, challenges him to a duel. And this is actually the actual spark for the duel. It's not the 1800 election. Although that's part of it. These guys aren't moments in history, they're composites of their lives. But this was actually the thing that sparked the duel. It's just too much to tell in a musical, and so you condense the timeline a little bit. Yeah. Roman numeral number 4. Well, the Napoleonic, number 4. Is this what I'm looking at? Yeah, okay. As the Napoleonic Wars ravaged Europe, Britain and France refused to respect the neutrality of American merchant vessels. Besides the Barbary pirates, we also end up in tangles with the British and the French. The French are like, no, you can't go. I know you're neutral, America, but you're trying to do business with our enemy, and we won't have that. So the French try to close off British ports from American ships from importing things into the country. The British say, America, I know you're neutral, but you can't go trade with our enemies. And so the British end up trying to stop American ships from reaching the mainland. The British also add another level to it. They do what's called impressment. This is a good vocab term for you, impressment, where the British say American ships probably have British deserters who are trying to escape being their proper service in the British Navy. So when we capture American ships, we will look for any British people and force them back into the Navy. And how do they do this? They say, well, English people speak English. And so all these people on I'm oversimplifying, but all these Americans on this boat are probably English dissenters, and they start forcing American sailors to go fight in the British Navy to do so. This impressment. I'm not impressed, but that's what it's called. And so Jefferson was like, all right, we just want to stay neutral and do business. You guys fight your fight. We don't have a dog in this fight. But they're like, no, you are the dog in the fight. So Jefferson devised the Embargo Act of 1807, where he says, okay, fine, both of you countries, you're cut off. We're not doing business with either one of you. And no American ships will leave their home ports until Britain and France repeal these restrictions. Now, what is the result of the Embargo Act of 1807? It does nothing for Britain and France. They're just like, whatever, America is kind of small potatoes. You know who it does hurt? Americans. It actually hurts American farm exports and international trade. And as soon as you drop trade restrictions on one side, the other side drops the same trade restrictions. Both countries refuse to trade with America, and we're not going to do trade with them anyway. And it actually ends up hurting the American economy far worse than it affects Britain or France. Subpoint B. In 1908, Thomas Jefferson is going to step down from office. And in 1908, Thomas Jefferson is wildly unpopular. Everybody is sick of his crap. Oh, sorry, 1808. I keep saying that. 1808. Everybody is just sick of Jefferson's crap. He has gotten us tangled in other people's wars. He's ruining our economy. He's hurting settlers by opening up all this new land in the West and running the value of my property. Everybody's kind of sick of Jefferson nationwide. However, Jefferson has a lot of power left in government, and the Electoral College elects basically Jefferson's hand-picked successor, James Madison, our shortest American president with the worst hairline in presidential history. James Madison. So James Madison takes office. James Madison was a pretty experienced dude. He was a veteran of the Revolution. He was the former Speaker of the House. He's been Secretary of the State. He's the father of the Constitution, the author of all of the best Federalist Papers, and he takes office in a landslide. Madison says this embargo thing it backfired. We're going to stop the embargo. And so he replaces it with trade restrictions, but not an outright embargo, none of which actually help either. But Madison's like, yeah, well, stop harassing American ships or we'll resume that embargo. Which is kind of a worthless threat because it didn't work the first time. Threatening with it next time isn't going to work either. In Congress, he has a different group trying to get his ear, and it's a group known as the War Hawks. The War Hawks, largely Henry Clay. If you've been watching the Adam Norris videos on APUSH Review, Adam Norris is a big Henry Clay fan. So Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, to a lesser extent Daniel Webster, who's a fun story in his own right. But let's focus on these guys in the House of Representatives, and they are a group known as the War Hawks. This term still exists today, a hawk and a dove. A hawk is a person that generally thinks you can settle international conflict with fighting. They got their sword in the scabbard and they rattle their saber to let everybody know of the power. That's a war hawk. On the other side, you have the doves. The doves say, maybe we can negotiate our way out of this. Maybe we don't have to go to war all the time. The war hawks are in Madison's ear, and they say, hey, you know how you solve this problem with the trade embargoes and the impressment of soldiers, and you solve it with good old fighting. Now Madison's been around the block. He knows what's up. And in 1795, James Madison had written about war. He'd said that, well, let's see, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's do a sidebar here first. Then we'll talk about this war thing. So, point C. Indian relations were breaking down in the West. Jefferson tried to solve the Indian problem by assimilating Indians. Just try to behave like proper white people with farms and trade. And if you can't, then go west. Go on the other side of the Mississippi River and just go away. Jefferson tried to move the non-assimilated Indians west of the Mississippi River. And Native Americans, of course, didn't think this was a whippy idea. And so there are two Shawnee Indians, Chief Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, I think is how you say that. He's also called the Prophet, but he's not the guy on CNBC now. Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, the Prophet, and they decide to lead an Indian resistance force against the American settlers. And they established what's called the Western Confederacy. And it's all of these different Native American tribes who agree in a confederal model to go fight against the American settlers. And they're led by Chief Tecumseh, and like this kind of the spiritual leader is his brother, the Prophet, Tenskwatawa. And they set up at a place called Prophetstown in Illinois, and it becomes the site of the battle. Nearly 400,000 Americans lived west of the Appalachian Mountains, far greater than any of the Indian territories there. And in a settlement called Prophetstown, today it's in Illinois. At the time it's just the Indiana Territory. Okay, so Prophetstown in the Indiana Territory. Tecumseh called for attacks on American frontier settlements. Following a series of clashes in November of 1811 between settlers and the Western Confederacy, William Henry Harrison, this guy over here in the bottom right corner with the bad hair, William Henry Harrison, who's the governor of the Indiana Territory, puts on his military uniform and led an army against the Prophetstown village, led it against Tenskwatawa, fended off the Western Confederacy at the Battle of Tippecanoe, and burned the village to the ground. William Henry Harrison, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. People begin just like calling him that. They're like, yeah, William Henry Harrison, oh, Tippecanoe. He really put those Indians in their place. And that becomes his nickname, Old Tippecanoe. William Henry Harrison from the Battle of Prophetstown. Battle of Tippecanoe at Prophetstown. Roman numeral number 5. Okay, in 1795, James Madison had been against war. During the Washington administration, Madison was against war. He said that war is the parent of armies. And armies bring debt and taxes. And armies and debt and taxes are only used to oppress people. And that if you bring the domination, you bring many under the domination of the few. But those warhawks, Calhoun and Henry Clay, hoped to gain new territory and discredit the Federalists. They urged Madison to go to war with Great Britain, whom we're mad at anyway. With the elections approaching in 1812, James Madison decides that he needs to make a big move and raise his profile. And he asks Congress for a declaration of war out of respect for American sovereignty. In June of 1812, a sharply divided Senate voted for war, and the House of Representatives came along with them. The United States officially entered the War of 1812 with Britain to protect the commercial rights of a neutral nation. But in reality, this is a political move for Madison to stand for re-election and needs to look strong. The government found it very difficult to finance this war with England. There wasn't much of a tax base left. Jefferson had cut all the taxes just down to the tariffs. Our military was very small. Madison doesn't even like the way that we would borrow money to the Bank of the United States. Madison doesn't like the Bank of the United States. He's like, well, the whole thing seems corrupt and big businessy. I would rather go borrow on the open market. And he goes up to like local banks, Commerce Bank, Goliath National Bank, tries to take out a loan. And they're reluctant to do business with him because the bankers are all Federalists, and they're like, why would we do business with you into a war that would just further your political career that we don't think is important anyway? So we get into the War of 1812. We are underfunded and undermanned, and a war that doesn't really matter anyway, and right away we start to lose it. We try to make a couple of incursions into Canada, up into British territory into Canada. The British kind of like fend us off, and they're unsuccessful. The British, their heart isn't in this thing. What's going on in Europe in 1812? The Napoleonic Wars. They're far more dangerous than Americans annoying them on a different continent. They have much bigger fish to fry in Europe. Then, in 1812, at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon is put down, exiled to St. Helena in the South Atlantic on a volcanic island where he can be safely ignored. And the British say, okay, now that we've fried the big fish, let's go take care of this thing in America. And they put their whole heart into the War of 1812 on American soil. There, they advance all the way down into Washington, D.C. and torch the White House. They burn it to an empty shell. I mean, there's like movie scenes where there's floors crashing around it and things are exploding in fire. We actually didn't think the British would take Washington, so we didn't defend it at all. American troops were up in Baltimore, which was a way more important city. There's nothing in Washington except the White House and a few settlements around it. So the British kind of swoop in, burn the whole building at once, burn the whole city down at once, there's not much in it, and run out. Dolly Madison, the First Lady, FLOTUS in your notes, First Lady of the United States. Dolly Madison is like running out of the burning White House, and she's like, oh no, we have to go save something. And Dolly Madison had excellent taste. She says, you have to go get the Washington portrait. Everybody's like, really? Like, we will die in that building over a piece of art. She says, but it's the Washington portrait. Crap. So they run back into the burning building, and they try to take the painting off the wall. It's nailed to the wall. What are we going to do? So they pry it off. They crack the frame. They roll it up like a rug, and they're running out the door while the building is crashing down behind them. It's basically the only thing that survives, and it's the cover of your packet right now. It's like the most important and famous portrait of Washington ever, and it's Dolly Madison. Yeah, he's not doing the Macarena. It's a great painting. I hope to talk about it some other time. But so it runs out. The Indian tribes sided with the British. They're like, yeah, this sounds like an awesome way to go harass Americans who've been harassing us. They sided with the British in the Midwest and the South. We actually are able to defeat them. And in January of 1815, in a story we'll talk about more about if we don't run out of time, Andrew Jackson ends up taking the only real victory of the war at the Battle of New Orleans, and more about that in a minute. The War of 1812 was a disaster. It's a total debacle. The United States prevented a major invasion of Canada in the East. New Englanders opposed the war. Boston merchants hated it and refused to lend any money to it. After 2 years of sporadic warfare, the United States had made no incursions into Canada, was fighting a defensive war on the Atlantic. The capital city was burned down, and the British drop a blockade on us, which is further ruining the American economy. In the Southwest, Andrew Jackson led an army of militiamen to victory over British-supported Creek Indians at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, and forced Indians to go cede land. The war continued to go badly, though. An American naval victory on Lake Champlain barely averted a British invasion of the Hudson River. And then British troops landed outside of New Orleans and threatened to cut off American trade on the Mississippi River. It was here, that America wins its most important battle. But you know when it happens? It happens after the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1814. American sides negotiating trying to end this war on December 24th of 1814 signed the Treaty of Ghent and end the war in kind of in a stalemate. We've kind of lost all the big battles, but we were able to negotiate a stalemate. But they negotiated in Ghent, which is, I think, in Germany, and they got to like float the treaty back to America and then read it and then like make copies of it and send it out on horses to all the places. Hey, stop shooting, war's over. Actually, after the war is over is when Andrew Jackson makes his big rally at the Battle of New Orleans, where he routs the British troops and claims a victory, makes Jackson a national hero, but also means that we won the last battle of the War of 1812, which means Americans can walk out saying like, well, if you win the one at the end, then you're the winner, and we won the War of 1812, so ha! Andrew Jackson was a tough dude. His nickname was Old Hickory, and I think of that he gets the nickname Old Hickory because he's a tough piece of wood. And Andrew Jackson would like strict enforcement of his troops. This guy was an AH. He was an apple hanger, man. This guy, huge apple hanger, huge AH. If somebody wanted to like, he was just sick of him, and you wanted to like, I quit. Jackson would shoot deserters. He wouldn't like arrest them and call them back into a military tribunal. Like, no. He would just shoot them in the back as they fled. Jackson was also accused of just like shooting people he didn't like. Deserter. Pain in the butt. Deserter. Yeah, sometimes people get shot. It's Jackson was a tough dude. When he comes out of the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans, as like everybody's favorite hard A and big time winner at the end, which he parlays to a brilliant political career. Who actually won the War of 1812? Well, in terms of like fighting, it's at best a stalemate. It's at best, like, nobody really, this is not an important war. But the great thing about the War of 1812, and here's why like America swells with pride over it, it's that we don't just totally fall apart as a country. The American experiment can prove that a republic can conduct a war without falling into anarchy or just like folding up shop, that we can have our capital burned to the ground and be like, the republic continues. That's the miracle of the War of 1812. Not that the war is actually military important. It's not. It's militarily unimportant. But we prove that we can hold up in the face of battle, and that's really the great thing about the War of 1812. Madison was narrowly reelected in 1812 amidst an anti-war settlement, but the Federalists lost again. This means the Federalists have lost in 1812, in 1808, in 1804, and in 1800, and that their last electoral success was John Adams, which was not a great success. And so the Federalists say like, we kind of keep getting whooped. Is our party still viable? Like, are we really like a political organization? And they called together a meeting in Hartford, Connecticut, what becomes known as the Hartford Convention. And it's like the last gasp of the Federalists. They said, you know what, Virginia has too much power. That 3/5 compromise is giving them too much power in the legislature. It's getting all those Virginians elected to the presidency, and it shouldn't happen. The South has too much power. They began saying that like states need the right to interpose their authority. Whenever federal law is unconstitutional, states need to stick up, which is kind of a Jeffersonian idea, but the Federalists pick it up here when it's politically expedient. And then Jackson's victory at New Orleans, basically the Hartford Convention's like, all right, fine, it looks like they're going to win. And within a few years, the Federalist Party is disbanded and irrelevant, but they did raise an issue, Southern domination of the government. Okay.